What you're experiencing right now isn't a delay, even if it feels unfamiliar. Quiet or strangely unproductive, it may actually be a time of preparation. Learning to tell the difference between those two states can help you move through this phase with more ease instead of resistance. It's natural to think that when nothing visible is happening, something must be wrong. But growth doesn't always show itself right away. Sometimes the groundwork is being laid first, not for the outcome itself, but for the person who will eventually step into it. And preparation almost never looks like forward movement. This phase can feel confusing because it gently removes the signals you once relied on. The urgency that used to drive you may have softened. The goals that once felt magnetic might not pull with the same force anymore. You may even notice a quiet disinterest in chasing the things you were once certain would fix everything. This isn't a loss of ambition, it's recalibration. The system is adjusting so something larger can settle into place. From a quantum perspective, asking for change doesn't always set off a chain of external events. Instead, it begins a subtle reorganization of possibility, and possibility doesn't move cleanly into form all at once. If your inner state is still aligned with an older version of yourself, the field doesn't respond to desire alone, it responds to coherence. And coherence often asks for inner rearranging before outer results appear. That's why this phase can feel like nothing is happening, even though so much is shifting beneath the surface. Your perception is changing first, and your circumstances will follow. Your tolerance for noise, pressure, and unnecessary struggle is beginning to fade. The old rewards don't satisfy you in the same way anymore, not because you failed to reach them, but because they no longer feel aligned with who you are becoming. Interestingly, neuroscience points to something similar. Before a meaningful shift in identity, the brain often enters a period of uncertainty. Motivation tied to dopamine can dip, and familiar patterns lose their pull. This isn't a breakdown, it's adaptability. The nervous system is loosening old expectations to make room for new ones. During this window, the mind can misread neutrality as stagnation, even though it's often one of the most fertile conditions for change. On a more inner or spiritual level, this is the space between identities. You no longer feel like who you were, but you don't yet feel fully settled into who you're becoming. That in-between can feel uncomfortable because it lacks clear reference points. There's nothing urgent to chase and nothing obvious to fix. For a system that learned to associate constant movement with safety, that kind of stillness can feel unsettling. This is often where people step in too quickly. Silence can be mistaken for failure and momentum gets forced. More pressure, new goals, affirmations, or distractions get added, even though they can quietly pull you back into old patterns just as they're loosening. From a quantum perspective, the field responds to that interference by pausing, not as punishment but as care and precision. What you asked for isn't late, it's waiting for alignment. And alignment isn't built through effort alone. It grows through release, through letting go of the inner habits that might distort what you're inviting in if it arrived too soon. That's why preparation can feel like subtraction. Less noise, less urgency, less emotional charge. You're not being emptied because something is missing. You're being cleared because something new needs space. The field doesn't layer new realities onto unstable identities. It waits for coherence. Trust becomes especially important here, not as blind faith, but as a gentle willingness to stay present even when the mind no longer has familiar evidence to rely on. This is where control begins to loosen and intuition becomes clearer. You may notice you're less reactive, less attached to specific outcomes, and more aware of timing. That isn't detachment, it's alignment starting to settle. If you feel a little removed from your old life but not anxious about what's next, you're not lost. You're being gently repositioned. The version of you that asked for change can't receive it from the same inner posture that made the request. Something has to shift first, and that shift is already in motion. This phase isn't asking you to do more. It's asking you to stop interrupting what's already unfolding, to ease the need for proof before the inner adjustment has finished. Preparation feels invisible only because it's happening at the level that quietly shapes everything else. What you asked for already exists as possibility, and possibility becomes real when the observer is steady enough to experience it as normal. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, just natural. If you're here feeling quiet but attentive, less driven yet more aware, this isn't life passing you by. It's alignment taking place. And when preparation completes, what arrives may not feel explosive, it may feel inevitable. One of the harder parts of this phase is that it gives the mind very little to measure. There's no checklist, no clear milestone, no outside confirmation that you're on the right path. Because the mind learned to equate movement with progress, it can label this state as stagnation. But stagnation is rigid. What you're experiencing is fluid. When preparation begins, it often doesn't add energy, it removes interference. And removal can feel like emptiness to a system that has long identified with effort, urgency, and intensity. The silence isn't absence, it's space being made. That's why preparation can feel like life is slowing down around you. Conversations may start to feel repetitive. Old goals can seem oddly irrelevant. Situations that once triggered strong emotional reactions might not hook you in the same way anymore. This isn't passivity. It's your nervous system no longer responding from the survival patterns that once shaped your identity. From a quantum perspective, possibility tends to settle into form when noise quiets. The field doesn't respond well to scattered signals. It responds to clarity. And clarity often comes through subtraction before addition. It's hard to tune into something new while parts of the old signal are still being broadcast. Neuroscience offers a similar explanation. When the brain prepares for a shift in identity, it can temporarily loosen old reward loops. Dopamine-driven motivation softens. The constant chase loses some of its appeal. This isn't depression, it's disengagement from patterns that no longer fit. The brain is freeing up bandwidth. That's why many people describe this phase as neutral, not particularly happy or sad, just quiet. Neutrality can feel unsettling if your life has long moved between wanting and resisting. But it's often in neutrality that reorganization happens. It's where new internal expectations can form without being overridden by old ones. Spiritually, this space has been described as a void, a desert, or a wilderness, not because it's empty, but because familiar orientation falls away. The old compass no longer works, and the new one hasn't fully calibrated yet. This is also where trust is often misunderstood. Trust isn't convincing yourself that something good will happen. It's allowing the process to unfold without needing constant reassurance. Stillness becomes the test, not chaos. Distractions fade, space opens, and you notice whether you rush to fill it. Many people do, simply because quiet can feel unsafe to an identity built around movement. Overthinking, overplanning, and overproducing can creep back in, not out of necessity, but out of habit. And when that happens, it gently pulls attention back toward patterns that were already loosening. Preparation here isn't about doing nothing. It's about restraint, about noticing when you're about to add noise and choosing not to. This isn't discipline in the traditional sense. It's awareness maturing. The reason this phase feels invisible is because the changes are happening at the level that quietly shapes everything else. Your relationship with time is beginning to change. You may feel less rushed, less reactive, and more selective. Even that alone can shift outcomes, sometimes before anything external visibly changes. You might also notice your intuition becoming clearer, not in a dramatic or mystical way, but in a practical one. You sense when to move and when to pause. You stop forcing clarity and allow it to arrive on its own. This is coherence starting to form, and coherence is what signals readiness. It helps to remember that preparation doesn't feel good in the way motivation does. It feels steadier, more grounded, and less emotionally charged. That calm can fool the mind into thinking nothing important is happening. But the most meaningful shifts rarely announce themselves with intensity. They settle in quietly and often only feel obvious in hindsight. If you're in this phase, your role isn't to speed it up. Trying to accelerate can disrupt coherence. Instead, it's about staying present without needing to define what's coming next, letting old inner structures loosen without rushing to rebuild them. This is the part of change that can't be hurried, because it determines whether what arrives will last. Nothing is being withheld from you. Stability is simply being established before things move into form, and once that stability is there, the shift doesn't require force, it requires recognition. You'll know it when it happens because nothing inside you will resist it. What you asked for didn't pause because it was too big. It paused because the version of you who asked wasn't quite ready to sustain it yet. This is a part of manifestation that's often left out. Not every desire can land within the same identity that created it. Change doesn't arrive in isolation. It arrives as an entire state of being, with its own demands for awareness, responsibility, and regulation. When those pieces aren't in place, things don't disappear. They arrive too early and fall apart. The outer reality shows up before the inner structure can hold it. Old coping patterns resurface, the nervous system becomes overwhelmed, and it can feel like something was lost, when really it simply arrived before it could be integrated. What you're being prepared for now isn't just the outcome you asked for. It's the version of you who can live inside that reality with steadiness and ease. From a neurological perspective, this makes a lot of sense. The brain is built around prediction and familiarity. When something arrives that goes beyond what the nervous system recognizes as normal, it can be experienced as a threat, even when it's something positive. That can show up as self-sabotage, withdrawal, or a need to over-control. The brain isn't trying to ruin anything. It's trying to preserve a sense of internal safety. That's why preparation often focuses on identity before outcome. The system needs time to learn that a new reality is safe, sustainable, and familiar. And that learning doesn't come from imagination alone. It develops through gradual internal recalibration, less urgency, more presence, and a gentler relationship with control. Spiritually, this has long been described as an expansion of capacity. You don't receive only what you want, you receive what you can hold. And holding something new often requires letting go of the structures that were built to survive without it. This is where the process can feel uncomfortable, because what shifts first isn't your circumstances, but your sense of self. You may notice that the version of you who needed to struggle, prove, or constantly anticipate what's next no longer feels right. That identity can start to feel heavy or outdated. Preparation often includes forms of loss that aren't dramatic. A loss of urgency, a loss of emotional charge, a quiet fatting of what once fueled ambition. The mind can read this as regression, but it is. It's transition. You're releasing the emotional mechanisms that once kept you moving when coherence wasn't available yet. Effort was a bridge, not a destination. The habits that helped you navigate the old reality aren't the ones that will sustain the new one. Until they soften, the shift can't fully complete. This is where patience matters, not passive patience, but embodied patience. Staying present without demanding immediate proof. Remaining open without trying to control timing. Trusting that internal restructuring isn't wasted time, but part of the necessary sequence. When identity stabilizes, change tends to move more easily. Things don't arrive explosively, they align naturally. Opportunities feel obvious rather than miraculous. Decisions require less overthinking. Action happens at the right moment because your inner timing begins to match the outer one. If you're feeling less desperate, less reactive, and less focused on controlling how everything unfolds, that isn't a sign you've stopped wanting what you asked for. It's a sign you're becoming more compatible with it. You're not being asked to want less. You're being invited to become steadier. And stability doesn't come from more effort. It grows through release. What you asked for isn't waiting on the other side of time. It's waiting on the other side of identity. And once that identity settles, there's very little that needs to be forced. Things begin to recognize you naturally. Trust, at this level, isn't what it's often described as. It isn't optimism, positive thinking, or pretending everything will work out. It's more structural than that. It's what remains when the impulse to interfere starts to fall away. Trust tends to become important right before something moves into form, because interference is often the last thing keeping the old identity in place. As long as there's a strong urge to check, adjust, rush, or control, part of you is still oriented toward a version of yourself that doesn't quite believe life can meet you without constant effort. From a quantum perspective, things settle into form when observation stabilizes, not when desire is strongest or emotion is most intense, but when the observer stops oscillating. And that oscillation usually comes from doubt disguised as vigilance. This is why trust the universe can feel frustrating advice to people whose sense of safety was built through control. To a nervous system shaped by survival, trust can feel risky, like letting go of the only leverage you have. But control was never really leverage, it was compensation. Neuroscience reflects this clearly. When the brain senses uncertainty, it increases monitoring and prediction, which creates mental noise, and noise disrupts coherence. Trust, by contrast, signals safety. As the nervous system softens its grip, perception widens. Timing improves. Decisions become simpler. You're less likely to miss opportunities because you're no longer bracing against life. Spiritually, trust is the moment you stop negotiating with the future. You no longer need to ask, "Is this working?" or "Am I doing this right?" Those questions belong to an identity that believes alignment has to be constantly earned. An aligned identity doesn't ask them because it no longer doubts its own compatibility. This is also why trust can feel surprisingly ordinary. There's no emotional surge, no drama, no intense anticipation, just steadiness. And steadiness is what allows things to reorganize efficiently. The field responds to stable signals more easily than anxious ones. What often goes unnoticed is that impatience tends to delay things more than doubt ever could. Impatience subtly declares that the present moment isn't enough, and that keeps attention oriented toward lack, even when everything else is lining up. Trust isn't passive, it's precise. It's staying internally consistent without external confirmation. This is why the final stage of preparation can feel like restraint. You may feel the urge to act, explain, or move things along, and you choose not to, not because action is wrong, but because it isn't required yet. Timing is, and timing can't be forced without disturbing what's forming. When trust settles in, synchronicity often increases quietly. Conversations land differently. Things meet you with less resistance, almost as if they've been waiting for the signal to steady. Information starts to arrive right when it's useful. Opportunities don't feel lucky so much as timely and obvious. That's often a sign that your inner timing is beginning to sync with how life responds. This can feel like one of the final internal adjustments, when you stop asking reality to prove itself and stop watching the door, and instead remain open to what fits. There's a quiet paradox here. When trust truly settles in, the urgency around when something arrives tends to soften, and that release is often what allows things to move forward at all. Trust doesn't say, "I hope this works." It says, "I don't need to interfere." At that point, the old identity has very little left to do. Its strategies don't guide you the same way, and its fears no longer steer your decisions. Without that resistance, what you asked for continues unfolding naturally. If you find yourself calm without clear answers, steady without guarantees, and less focused on timing than you once were, this isn't giving up. It's alignment becoming precise enough that effort isn't required in the same way. When that happens, change doesn't feel magical, it feels natural. Often the only thing that was ever in the way was interference. Here, preparation shifts from something you understand to something you live. You don't need more insight so much as steadiness, the kind that doesn't rise and fall with mood, timing, or outside validation. This is where things tend to complete themselves quietly, not through action, but through alignment that no longer needs constant attention. What you asked for was never waiting on the right circumstances outside of you. It was waiting for the inner environment to become coherent enough to receive it without distortion. And that coherence isn't excitement or certainty. It's a calm readiness, neutral, present, and available. This is why the final phase often isn't dramatic. There's no emotional peak or sudden revelation. Instead, there's a subtle internal shift, a sense that you no longer need to chase clarity or rehearse the future. You're here, responsive, grounded, and aware. From a quantum perspective, this is when possibility settles into form, not because it was demanded, but because the observer stabilized. Life doesn't rush to impress. It reorganizes efficiently when the signal is clear, and clarity usually arrives after interference quiets. Neuroscience reflects this too. When the nervous system moves out of hypervigilance, perception sharpens. You notice opportunities without searching. You respond instead of react. Decisions feel lighter, more obvious. That isn't luck, it's regulation meeting timing. Spiritually, this is receiving without grasping. You're no longer trying to make something happen. You're allowing life to meet you where you already are. And because there's less internal resistance, what arrives feels stable rather than overwhelming. Sometimes people misread this quiet. They expect change to feel explosive, and when it feels subtle, they assume they missed it. But subtlety is often the mark of alignment. Loud changes tend to belong to unstable systems. Stable shifts arrive softly. You don't need to announce that your life is changing. You don't need to prove that you're aligned. And you don't need to explain who you're becoming. The less you interfere, the more smoothly things tend to settle into place. If you're in this phase, what's being asked of you now isn't more effort but consistency. Consistency of presence, consistency in how you relate to yourself, and consistency of trust without drifting into passivity. You move when movement feels clear. You pause when pausing feels neutral. You stop trying to assign meaning to every delay. This is also where gentle structure can help, not as a way to make something happen, but as a way to stay steady while things reorganize. Nothing here is about chasing life or convincing it to respond. What you asked for is already in motion, adjusting around the version of you that no longer needs to interfere. And when it arrives, it may not feel like a miracle. It may feel more like recognition, like something settling into place because it belongs there. The truth is fairly simple. Even if it took time to understand, you were never being held back. You were being prepared. And preparation completes itself the moment you no longer need proof.